Devils by Alex R. Oliver. Chapter 3, in which Frank is the mouse in a game of cat and mouse. "You," the horseman snarled at Frank. "Tell me, where have they gone? Why have they left you? Speak fast and make sense, for I am looking for someone to blame. Do not be that person." Frank's mouth was so dry he could barely force words out. It didn't help that the man punctuated every sentence by shaking him. The grip of his fingers was marking Frank's arms with deep bruises, and his shattered body burst with pain every time he was jerked about. It was overwhelming, after so long alone, to be so violently, physically close to another man, and his heart raced and shivered under his breastbone as he groped after his fleeting words. I don't know, The Lord backhanded him casually. He was a big man, tall and broad, and his lazy blow took Frank off his feet, threw him 5 yards, and had him tumble down on the wounded shoulder rather than on the broken ribs. The agony was on about the same. Frank screamed. It seemed he had nothing at all to be proud about, so why not? "You fucking bastard! You awesome bastard! I don't know anything!" He expected them to be his final words. He looked up breathless, waiting for the Lord's fury to leap into white heat, for him to draw that long blade at his side and hack Frank's head off. It was a long, startled moment before he realized that he was seeing curiosity instead. "What language is that?" The man closed the distance between them again, wrenched Frank to his feet by the collar. Frank took the chance to rest a little, held up by the shirt digging into his armpits. "I don't... What? What is the matter with you?" Under Frank's weight, the shirt had untucked from the sash at the back. Now his interrogator pulled it sharply over his head and off. He breathed in through his teeth at the sight of all Frank's bruises, the blood crusted on his bandages, and the strapping of his shoulder now come awry, revealing the swollen, angry red of the flesh beneath. "You are very pale for a Romany," said the Lord at last, considering, "though you are clothed like one. Come now, pull yourself together, and tell me what I ask, lest I serve you worse than whatever you have already suffered." Frank wiped his face again with his bad hand. "I am a..." What did he know about himself? A disgrace to England. "I'm an Englishman of good family. My name is Frank." The surname still eluded him. "I was attacked by bandits. On the river, I think. I don't remember things. I was hit in the head hard. When I woke up, some Romany helped me. They bandaged me, gave me clothes, told me to come here. I arrived only this morning, found the place deserted, everyone gone. I don't know." "I see." The boyar's face smoothed further towards civility. A wide, strong face, very regular and handsome, except that he had odd eyes. A fold of eyelid at the outer edge made them almost triangular. It gave him a suspicious, sarcastic look, even when, as now, his expression might otherwise have been called pleasant. "I was told a fortnight ago that 3 English travellers sought permission to enter my lands to view the vril accumulator at Salka. Young scholars, they said, from Cambridge. You are one of these?" "I don't..." A new and unexpected pain throbbed through Frank's chest. I don't remember. It makes sense to have travelled with friends." His voice, quite by itself, slipped into a higher register. I had friends. What happened to them? If I'm alive, might they not be too?" Doors began to reopen in the village behind them, as the man's troops came out into the sunlight. The oldest of them wore long walrus moustaches that curved down to either side of their shaven chins, and made their scowls look larger than their faces. Very foreign they looked to Frank, proud and brutal and dangerous. Frank straightened up, trying not to show any more weakness, and although there was a flatness behind the boyar's eyes that matched his men's ungentle faces, he gave a small, cold glimmer of a smile. "Well, Frank, I am Radu Vacarescu, boyar of Valcia." "You! You are Vacarescu!" He'd known it, of course, the moment he recognised the man's silhouette. He still didn't quite believe it. The nightmare hunter that had threatened to tear out his throat and drink, why would it be standing in front of him now, pretending to have forgotten him? The temperature of the conversation, already chilly, dropped into ice. "Someone has been saying unflattering things about me." Frank pulled in his scattered pieces with quick concern. "No, no, simply that the Roma who rescued me said they did it for you, because they wanted to please you." The anger was back like a bit in Vacarescu's mouth. He jibbed at it. "I'm glad somebody around here shows me the deference I am owed." "I owe you my life," said Frank, intending it to be soothing. It worked a little too well. The boyar looked at him again, the long, speculative look of a farmer sizing up a cow at market. "So you do. I will think on what I can ask of you to repay me." He lowered Frank to the ground and walked away, speaking in low tones to the leader of his men, an ancient noble, with a moustache as silver as a scythe, and blue and green flowers embroidered over every inch of his faded red coat. This gentleman took half of the band and led them trotting out of the village on the other side, over the bridge beneath which Frank had washed up this morning, and away, raising dust clouds among the wild flowers, down the road he had not travelled. Two of those left picked Frank up and manhandled him onto the boyar's horse. Vacarescu swung up fluidly behind him, having to reach past him for the reins. The cage of the man's arms and legs supported Frank like a high-backed chair, making it far less likely that Frank would slide sideways and fall off from exhaustion. Despite his fears, there was something to be said for having a broad chest behind him, softened by fur coat, into which he could lean, and it was pleasant indeed to be surrounded by warmth and not to have to walk any longer. Relaxing by degrees, he softened in the older man's arms, and though he still thought he should be afraid, he was too exhausted and comfortable to quite manage it. "Do you know anything about my friends?" Half question, half yawn. Vacarescu leaned forward and put his sharp-edged smile against Frank's ear. The white teeth grazed his skin, made him shudder. "Alive or dead, they will be brought to me. Everyone comes to us in the end." Frank had intended to stay alert, but the flesh was weak. He found himself jostled awake in the courtyard of a spun-sugar castle, all narrow, tall turrets and graceful buttresses of silvery stone, with blue-grey roofs like high witches' hats, all of it reflecting the sky in a cool silver gleam. Stiffly climbing down from the horse, he stood unsupported on the courtyard's cobbles, while grooms and servants milled around the returned soldiers. Vacarescu spoke to several of them, leaning down to give instructions. One quick, cold glance back, and he rode off, a busy man with many other things to do, and that too was not at all characteristic of the thing that had so lately seemed narrowly focused on seeing Frank dead. "You poor young man!" Frank startled as his arm was taken by a grey-haired woman, who bore an impressive set of keys on a chatelaine at her belt. She had a smile as warming as mulled wine, and her ruddy cheeks were creased with humour. But even she had that dull, flat taint in the back of her eyes that Frank had noticed among the men. A room in her mind was bolted shut and bricked over. "Come with me. I will have the doctor brought. We have a room being made up for you, and after you've been tended and have eaten, you may sleep as long as you like." The horses had been led away to their stables, and the men disappeared to their duties. Frank was left with the housekeeper and a burly maid whose eyebrows met above her nose, and whose top lip bore a line of hair almost as luxuriant. This Amazon pushed a small glass of palinka into his hand, which he supped down in one swallow. At once alcohol numbed his pains, warmed his innards, and made his head swim. He staggered, and she draped his good arm around her shoulders and supported him into the house. A second glass made him so merry he paid no attention to the dark looks of the doctor. Why should he care if the man was angry with him? The doctor's hands were brusque but thorough, and the shot of opium tincture Frank drank along with the spirits washed all Frank's pains straight out of him. Cleaned and bandaged, reclothed in a nightgown a dozen times finer than the coarse stuff of his borrowed shirt, he lay on his back in a proper bed, and could not be troubled by anything, least of all the doctor and the housekeeper arguing just outside the door. "What is the point?" the doctor was saying, his voice tight with frustration. "Why heal him if they're just going to... I protest most strongly that my arts are being used simply to assure he gives them better sport." The housekeeper's sigh was as soft as Frank's feather bed. "They are not beasts. Those of us who work here, we are never touched. Why should he not be the same? You think they'll spare him? A lone, friendless traveller who might, if let go, take tales of the family all the way back to England? You deceive yourself." "How else am I to live?" she said, so sharply that Frank stirred, not liking the sound of anguish. It seemed the doctor recognised pain, even when he had caused it himself. His voice gentled and slowed, the tone of it turning to what seemed like a delicate apology, even a reassurance. "At least they are not Austrians, or Turks. Whatever they are ours." "Yes," the housekeeper echoed his uncomfortable warmth, as though they shared a vice that each of them were ashamed of, that it reassured them to see in each other. "They are not Turks, not Austrians, not Hungarians, but ours. Ours forever." Frank closed his eyes, relieved that the argument was over. When he woke again, it was to the smell of deep cellars, where pungent rose perfume had been spilled. Gold light beat against his face, and the rest of his room lay in darkness. He startled up, his head throbbing, to find a young woman with a candle in her hand, bending over him in a curve of white and silver like a sickle moon. She eased away when he moved, and gave him an open, delighted smile from lips as pink as rosebuds. "Oh, hello," she said, moving away to a more comfortable distance. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to wake you. Shall I light the lamp?" "Please." She had a calm aura and a very pretty smile. When she touched her candle to the wick of the oil lantern which stood by Frank's bedside, the strengthening light made her seem doll-like, the delicacy of her hands and face overborne by the extraordinary volume and richness of her clothes. From her tall headdress of palest blue silk, white lace fell onto her shoulders like spun frost. Over her alabaster forehead lay swags of silver chains that tinkled as she moved. Ropes and ropes of pearls wound like a collar around her throat and hung down at varying lengths to cover her chest like a breastplate. She wore a pale grey silk waistcoat over a chemise whiter than moonlight, and a half-globe of silk skirts with an apron over it of lace so fine it might have been made by spiders, if spiders had the craft to work diamonds and stars and flowers into their webs. "I heard we had a visitor," she said, and sank down with a whisper of cloth on the chair by the writing-desk with which he had been provided. "I wanted to come and see you, make sure that he had not... that is, I wanted to make sure you were well provided for, and recovering. It isn't often we have foreign visitors who are not intent on conquering and enslaving us. She must have been perhaps 16 or 17. Vacarescu's daughter, if he had married early, or perhaps a younger sister. Her smooth face was full of the delight of meeting something new, boundless curiosity mingled with pity for his sorry state. He smiled, and thought better of the whole household, that it could raise such an innocent, and give her such an open and artless smile. I'm afraid I'm not very good company at present, he croaked. The opium had dried his throat, and though the headache was easing, he could gladly have slept again all night through. Who served you so ill? She rose and rustled out of the door, returning in a moment with a pitcher of water and a tumbler of cut glass. Filling it, she helped Frank up and arranged the pillows behind his shoulders so that he could sit and drink. Even there, I'm afraid I'm a disappointment. I don't remember, truly. Bandits, I thought at first, but I find I have a nagging doubt that it could be as simple as that. Now he'd said it, the doubt coalesced into something he could almost call a solid certainty. I don't know why, but he rubbed his temples as if he could massage the thought out of hiding. It didn't work. I feel as though disaster pursued me. I cannot remember fully who I am, but I'm sure I may be dangerous to you. Where I can go to outrun this curse I know not. I know not fully what it is, but... She laughed, a silvery chuckle that went well with her many pale jewels. You should not think too hard while you're wounded. Wait, and when you're well again, everything will come back to you. As for curses, we have no fear of them. For thousands of years our family has been here. We have owned this land and protected its people forever. The world has thrown armies at us. They come, and we fight. They go, and we are still here. There is nothing following you that we need to fear. Frank was amused now, too. She looked so earnest and so solemn, this maiden of a high-born house, who must only just have come out into society. He could see her in the nursery, refighting the battles of her ancestors, until their victories became her own. He felt he knew the type. Without specific memories to know on, he yet recognised the slim, straight-backed pride of the women of noble houses, who might never be called on to do more than pass that steel to their children, but who carried it in their bones nevertheless. It was strangely poignant in this overdressed, blue-eyed girl. That's good to hear, he said. But it's good that you be warned, too. You should tell your father in case he needs to... But Radu Vacarescu had real armies to fight, bandits to put down, villagers to hunt. He scarcely needed warning that Frank had his own inchoate dreads. Abruptly, Frank felt ashamed, and recognised the feeling as an old, familiar friend. The boy Arishna was smiling at him still, more delighted than ever. I don't think I introduced myself, she said. That was rude. I apologise. I am a liar, and you are? Frank. Would you like something to eat, Frank? You look starved. He felt it too. Though he'd eaten before he slept, the days of famine seemed to have left him feeling permanently hollow. When he looked down at himself, he saw he had not had much fat to lose. He was tall and spindly thin, as a mountain ash. Please. Again she went to the door, but no further. Either servants waited just outside, or she was reluctant to leave him alone. He remembered the cold, misty thing that had followed him down the river-bank, and was very glad of her company. He said the gypsies found you. Did they not feed you at all? They were very kind, Frank insisted, beginning to understand why they had been so adamant that he should speak well of them. Evidently, everyone expected the worst of them on principle. But they didn't have much to give. Her pretty frown became a wide-eyed look of pleasure. They live on the land, you know. They eat hedgehogs cooked in clay and berries, and they don't have to worry about anything. We take care of that, so that they can dance and sing all day long. I think it must be a lovely life." Frank's impression had been one of fear and reticence, but he saw no reason to trouble her sheltered naivety by saying so. "I still think," she went on, the frown returning, "that they shouldn't have made you walk. They should have put you on a horse and brought you here themselves. You were so hurt. You could have fallen down somewhere and died all alone, and then none of us would ever have known you. What were they thinking?" The perfect chance for him to ask some of the questions that had been plaguing him. "They were terrified of something," he said gently, only just realizing once he had started that he was about to accuse the girl's father to her face of being some kind of uncanny white, of roaming about the countryside threatening to tear out travellers' throats. But she had already let slip that her mind was uneasy, and her unbudging presence at his side was beginning to look less like innocent curiosity and more like protection. "They thought that the smell of my blood would draw someone, who would then, if I was still with them, turn on them all. Can you tell me what they meant?" "It is a peasant superstition," she said, easily enough, except that she had lowered her candid eyes to look at where her fingers twisted in her lap. "I suppose that as they are allowed to live without cares, like children, they will believe in all sorts of monsters and fairy tales, as children do." A servant entered, carrying a tray of 2 soups and a decanter of wine, which she set with brusque, silent swiftness on a stand by the bed. She dropped Frank a tiny curtsy, and Elia a much deeper one, and departed, never having raised her eyes from the floor. "Shall I help you?" Elia half rose, as if it was the polite thing to offer, but it was not much to her taste. Her nose wrinkled charmingly. "No, I'm fine." Strange to be so coddled now, when he had walked and swum and been knocked down while he was hurt worse. He manhandled the tray onto his lap and frowned at the bowls, not knowing where to start. Elia laughed and pointed. "That one is chicken. That one is beer with cinnamon and cream. It's very good. My mother used to give me that when I was hurt." He began with the chicken. This too was very good, full of vegetables and fruit, the stock thickened with sour cream, rich and filling. "I cannot think that the roamer's fear was entirely imaginary," he said, in a soft enough voice that the servants outside should not hear. "Something uncanny pursued me in the woods. I only just escaped from it." Her eyes widened, and her pale cheek blanched still further, until it was as white as her sleeves. "No. What did it look like?" The door opened again, and bending through came a silhouette that made Frank push himself backward with his feet, dislodging the tray. It fell to the floor, bowls breaking, liquids spattering over the fine old pale blue rug, as he crammed himself into the corner behind his pillows for sanctuary. His ears rang, and his eyes blurred, and his heart hissed in his breast like a live coal. Elia squeaked in alarm, stood and pressed herself against the wall, as though whether she was shocked at the visitor or simply reflecting Frank's fright, he hadn't the wits to tell. Then Vacarescu emerged from the shadow of the door into the lantern light, and gave them both a look of fierce displeasure. He doffed his tall hat, peeled leather riding gloves from his hands, and sat, uninvited and very much unwanted, at the very end of Frank's bed, where the impression of Frank's feet still warmed the blankets. "What are you doing here, my lady?" He turned his malign gaze on Elia, and if there was any familial affection there, it was well hidden. "There are rules about my guests. I would not have you forget them." "We were only talking." She seemed a great deal more immune to the cold, wolfish look than Frank, and her assurance allowed him to ease back down into the pillows, unclasping his hands from around his knees. With effort, he schooled his breathing from the sharp, high-pitched panting into something deeper, calmer, though he could not disguise the tremble in it as he could with his fingers. He did not relax his posture, because that would mean sliding his feet further toward the other man. He would as soon slide them into a fire. It is not fitting for you to be alone in the bedroom of a young man. But he's injured, and the servants are only just outside. They must be father and daughter, surely. For the look she gave Vacarescu now was all childish sweetness and cunning, like a toddler cajoling for a sweetmeat. He's come all the way from England. It isn't fair. You're forever shutting your visitors up in little rooms, and they disappear and we never get to meet them. This time you didn't seem very interested, so we've lost another village. So I thought I would just come and keep him company for you. We've been getting to know each other. It's been nice, hasn't it, Frank? Vacarescu's chest heaved as though something inside it wanted violently to break out. "First names already," he growled, in a tone that drew the point of a dozen pins down Frank's spine. Elia still looked unflappable, even pert, as if it amused her to see how far she could push, how hard her father would struggle before he gave up and struck her. They were not terribly alike in looks, but the urge to bait the wolves of hell had obviously been handed down. "I have no last name that I can remember," Frank broke in, desperate to ease the tension in the room before it snapped. Elia might have confidence in her father's restraint. He did not. The first name was all I could give. "You should leave now, madam." Vacarescu shifted his weight on the bed and pulled on the heel of one tall boot with the toe of the other. "We should both go and let him sleep." Apology in Elia's tone. She gathered her skirts as if to rise. "I will stay, to be sure he does not take ill in the night." Having towed his boots off, Vacarescu settled himself firmly at the foot of the bed, crossed his long legs, and made himself comfortable against the wall. Frank gave Elia a begging look, reluctant to be left alone with the man. She returned a brave little smile, as if to say she knew his thoughts, and settled back to her seat. "Then I'll help." Frank expected her father to order her out, but he simply sighed, crossed his arms over his chest, and settled. Elia turned the lantern down to brown dimness, and for a while it was awkward as hell. Every little rustle was like an alarm. But at some point Frank's body took over from his mind and told him it would sleep no matter the situation. He woke once in the night to the sound of movement, and found Vacarescu slumped sideways in a heap at the end of the bed. Elia was tucking a coverlet around him, like a girl playing mother. She raised a finger to her lips when she saw him watching, but did not abandon him. He fell asleep again, to the sound of Vacarescu's faint snore, as Elia smiled at him from the chair. When Frank woke again, with the morning light bright on his pillow, he was alone, the coverlet folded up on the chair where Elia had sat. He was brought breakfast and books by attentive servants who all tried hard not to look at him, and he passed an extremely welcome day of drinking medicinal tea and drowsing and allowing his body the leisure it needed to heal. Sometime after noon he looked from his window and saw rooftops and wooded hills going down to scrubby-looking farmland. A caravan of some sort moved slowly across the frame from right to left. Small figures with bent heads trudged beside tumbrils piled with what looked like lumber. Half the fields he could see contained rye that had turned an unhealthy greyish shade, and of the other half great patches stood ripe but unharvested. At the bottom of the road, down from the castle, a little hamlet of 4 houses and a well was tucked into an outcropping of rock, But though he looked at it on several occasions as the gloomy procession passed, he never saw smoke or movement. It occurred to him there might be something more behind Vacarescu's anger than mere choleric bad temper. But what? What was sweeping across an apparently populous and fertile land and causing the people to leave their homes, abandon the work of their hands and run? At the end of the day, his eyes were drifting closed over a volume of Homeric poets when Vacarescu accompanied his evening meal, and sat and watched him eat with a kind of resentful fascination that made Frank very glad when Elia joined them. She brought an embroidery frame with her, and talked quite unself-consciously about the history of her family, digging out of Frank everything he remembered about his travels, which was not much. Imperturbable, it wasn't that she endured Vacarescu's unsubtle sighs, his cut-off gestures of frustration and looks of baffled fury. More, it was though she had somehow trained herself not to see them at all. Her needle flashed in the lamplight, and peacocks with great trailing tails took shape under her fingers, so swiftly it seemed she painted them. Less exhausted now, Frank found it harder to sleep with the weight of the man on the bed, with the kindly scrutiny of the girl like another weight on his cheek. He spent the night drowsing, falling asleep only to jerk awake, increasingly raw to the silent battle of wills between his two companions. By the time dawn came, and both of them departed, he felt like a bone chewed between two dogs. He almost wished one of them would let go, just so this would all be over with. But every night for the next week this same scenario played out, until Frank wanted to scream at them both to tell him what they were playing at. He never quite found the courage, and they didn't say. By the end of a week of this, the constant tension of his nights meant Frank found it easier to stay awake while it was dark, and to sleep in blessed solitude once his demon and his angel had departed. Last night they had spent on cards, Frank up and dressed, moving his left arm cautiously but without too much pain. His ribs settled down to a dull ache, and strength returned to his legs. "I shouldn't think of troubling you much longer," he ventured, taking a 6 for 21, and trying to think of a plausible excuse to leave. They did not need to know that he had nowhere else to go. "I should return to Bucharest, where surely there will be someone who knows me and can reunite me with my family." Next to the almost palpable threat of something that had been growing in the room ever since he arrived, the thought of wandering alone in the world, never staying anywhere long enough for his misfortune to fall on those he encountered, did not have the desolation it once had. Between this household's secrets and endless flight, he thought endless flight the better option. "I can give you a boat," Vacarescu spoke quietly, his eyes on his cards. "And one, perhaps 2 men to go with you." "But there are many miles of river without habitation nearby at all," Elia objected. "And look what happened to Frank the last time he was alone in a boat with a few men. There are untold dangers out there to which he would be exposed once he left our protection." "No one would dare touch a man marked as our family's guest." Vacarescu glowered, edging his chair a little closer to Frank's. His knee, in the long trousers the men of this nation preferred to breeches, came to rest lightly against Frank's. Frank edged away. "In happier times," Elia made a pretty moue of affection. "That would be so. In happier times our people didn't pack up all their possessions and run off to Transylvania. If they have so little idea of what obedience means as to do that, do you think they'll obey us in this? They'll attack him just to spite us." Vacarescu breathed deeply and pressed his fingertips into his temples as if to soothe a headache. He did indeed look wearied. His eyes were blued beneath by the shadows of too little sleep. It is the Turks and their punitive taxes that they flee, not us. I thought it would improve when the Austrians left, but the Turks are worse. They say they mean to rule us for our own good, but truly I think their aim is to starve us out, so they can move their own people in here when we're gone. Elia bounced in her seat suddenly, causing the candle flames to flicker. She clapped her hands in glee. I have an idea. We could go to Bucharest. We could all go. I've always wanted to. Oh, think of it. We could open up the townhouse and have balls and carriage rides and evening supper parties by the lake and... No. You would be close to the voivode. You could talk to him. Tell him how we suffer. Ask him to make the people pay less. Something in the shape of Vacarescu's shoulders reminded Frank of bear baiting. The wounded animal pushed into the wall of the pit as the dogs gave tongue. I said, no. I've said no 1,000 times. Learn to be content. Elia scowled and fingered one of the silver chains that hung down by her ear. It was the first truly ugly expression Frank had seen on her face, and it threw into sharp contrast the artificial, mannequin-like quality to her innocence. It would be the only way we could be sure Frank had got there safely. Even to Frank, whose wits were returning slowly in a patchwork of dreams, there was something heavy in her words. Surely not a threat. But when he looked at Vacarescu, he saw again a powerful thing overmatched, a man fighting despair as well as terror. Could it be it wasn't himself the man feared at all, but his daughter? No. That made no sense. It was not a woman Frank had eluded on the path. Not a woman he had looked up at and seen Vacarescu's distinctive eyes and height. My strength is not yet so contemptible that anyone in this Banat can afford to challenge it. Elia shook her head, gently, so as to avoid dislodging her headdress, which today was the shape of a crescent moon and embroidered all over with gold. Maybe you're right. In any case, we must send to the villages to acquire provisions, and whatever else they'll need for the journey. It'll take a fortnight at least before we can equip Frank to depart. She turned her deep blue eyes on him, with an adoring look that might have suited a spaniel. I wish you would stay until you're completely better, she said. I don't like the thought of you on a long journey while you're still recovering. But if you're sure that's what you want, then give us a few weeks and we'll make it happen. A few weeks, Frank thought, his heart shrivelling at the thought. But perhaps he was being unfair, twisting their polite words into threats when none had been meant. Nothing had happened to him yet. It was possible nothing would. Maybe he had been knocked hard on the head and had simply imagined the demon that had bent close and breathed in his face. And the fear, everywhere in this country, choking around this house like a sulphurous fog, it could be due to politics, and a poor harvest, and the prospect of a long winter without food. Thank you, he said, because whatever other option was there, I am eternally obliged to you. The next night, everything changed. Voices woke him so early there was yet a little stain of blue in the western sky. For once he was alone in his chamber. The sound of an argument grumbled up from one of the other rooms in the castle, making strange echoes along the walls. He had so much recovered that he was not even stiff as he slid out of bed and clambered into the clothes they'd given him. Long russet trousers, embroidered shirt, a woolen waistcoat lined with silk, and an amber-coloured coat lined with hare fur. He crept quietly down the stone corridor, following the gleam that slid out from around a distant door. It was closed, a massive, ill-fitting thing, so old its greyed wood had shrunk away from the jamb on either side. leaving a gap fully an inch wide where it hung on its enormous hinges. There was little chance of those in the room looking through the gap and seeing him here, dark against the background of the dark corridor. But if he put his eye to the gap, he could see almost everything in the lit room beyond. And after all this subterfuge, it was only a pleasant sitting room, the ceiling and upper parts of the walls painted in sea green. The oak panelling below had been carved and gilded with lacework that spoke of Ottoman influence, like the geometrical designs of mosques. Vacarescu stood on one side of the fire, with his lips drawn back from his teeth, all but trembling with rage. On the other side, holding his gaze with an expression of paternal long-suffering, stood a tall gentleman Frank had not seen before. The family resemblance was remarkable. This man too had the powerful build, the straight-backed arrogance, and the pale, triangular eyes. But his long hair was white as paper, the light moving over it as it would over silk. His white beard hung down to his belt and flicked when he talked, like the tail of an angry cat. "Child," he said, gently, but with an undertone of steel, "your mother and I have decided it is long past time." He turned to a servant, blocked from Frank's view of sight. "Bring them closer." The suggestion of a bow just in the corner of Frank's vision, and then a white-veiled figure lurched into view as though someone had shoved her in the back. Frank almost gasped. "Mirella! No! Damn it, she was supposed to get away. All that cleverness and sacrifice was not supposed to amount to nothing at all. She was not supposed to be captured and brought here to—" As she straightened up, he saw that her long golden hair had been dressed and braided with new fresh flowers. Her plain shift had been replaced with finer linen that better showed off her statuesque figure. Her scowling face had been cleaned and painted, 2 spots of rouge on her cheeks subsumed under a flush of fury. Brought here to what, though? The old man inclined his head, and 2 other girls were supported into the globe of tricksy light around the family fire. One was weeping so hard she could barely stand, her face leaving smears of powder on the housekeeper's plain gown. Frank found it hard to believe that kindly matron would have anything to do with whatever this was, and she was indeed masked in iron discretion that could have hidden deeply buried repugnance. Alaya, seated on the opposite side of the hearth from Vacarescu and the old gentleman, carried on stitching at her embroidery frame. She scarcely glanced up either for Mirella's pride, or the second girl's tears, or the nervous trembling of the third. Vacarescu looked now as if he was carved from a single piece of ice, so rigid Frank could hardly see him breathe, except by the faint glimmer of his waistcoat buttons. His face was equally frozen, the knuckles of his clenched fists white as bone. "Constantin, you are the head of my family, you are my honoured father. Believe me, then, when I say it gives me no pleasure to ask you, have you gone mad? It is a parent's duty to find you a wife. Pick one." "I am Boyar of Valtia. But for the Turks I would be a prince, and you bring me 2 peasant girls and a Roma slave?" Though this set the third girl crying too, Mirella stiffened at it and looked at Vacarescu with narrowed eyes, blue as periwinkle, suspicious as a bull in a slaughterhouse. 3 peasant girls, Constantine corrected him, with an air of confused disdain. "You've only to look at them to see none of them is a gypsy. I would impale every member of any village that dishonoured us by sending us a slave." Leaning his arm against the mantel, Vacarescu stared into the heart of the fire, its amber light drenching the ends of his black hair with gold, and softening the harsh edges of his expression. Braced there, tall and young and richly dressed, Frank didn't think he looked too bad a prospect. If marriage rather than disgrace were on the table, Frank thought he would take that bargain. Why should the girls be so upset? He remembered shortly afterward that if he was desperate to escape this place after a week of kindness, perhaps it was not so unreasonable to fear being tied to it forever. Then he did not know what to think of his earlier willingness. He leaned his too warm forehead against the cold of the ancient stone wall, closing his eyes for a second. When he opened them again, he caught a strange gaze exchanged between Vacarescu and Mirella. Something more complex than insult showed in the lines around the man's eyes. If this had been a debating society, Frank would have surmised that Mirella had raised a point Vacarescu had never thought of before. But he was pausing and wondering if he could afford to engage with the curiosity it deserved. In exchange, Mirella's expression was uncertain, as though she had let some truth slip she had long been trying to keep secret. Her lower lip crept beneath her teeth, whitened as she bit. "Anka," Vacarescu said at last, visibly putting his curiosity aside. The housekeeper stepped forward. And yes, that was disgust, barely veiled in the line of her back. "My lord?" "Take the girls down to the kitchen, give them food, drink, and send them home." "In the dark?" Mirella demanded, her voice tight and high with nerves. By her side, the other two girls broke out into fresh tears. "You leave now, or you stay here till morning. Do what you think is best." Constantine and Elia gave matching little laughs at this, Elia covering her mouth with a decorous hand. The housekeeper, Anka, began supporting her half-fainted charges toward the door, looking alarmed. Mirella backed toward the far door, following them, passing out of Frank's sight. But he heard her voice once more, cold and shaking, say, "You are the only slave in this room, my lord." All the humanity ironed out of Vacarescu's expression, left it the perfect carved mask it so often was. Constantine hissed, and made to stride out in pursuit of the girls, but Vacarescu caught him by the arm and prevented it. What was the meaning of this elaborate insult to her? Not her taunt. Hers is beneath my notice, but yours. You have been giving orders to my servants again. My servants. You handed the rule to me, sir. They are mine. You cannot just take everything back when it suits you. And you cannot speak to me like that, young man. I am your elder. I will have your respect. Vacarescu gave a short bark of laughter and pressed his hand to the side of his head as though it hurt. The pause gave Elia time to set her sewing aside and get between the two of them. Very tiny she looked in comparison, and far too full of affectionate trust to be afraid. "Radu," she took his hand and pressed it. "We're your family. We want what's best for you, that's all. You should have someone to be there with you. It would make you happier." As any man would, Vacarescu softened at her gentle care. He sank wearily onto a stool with the fire at his back, stretched out his long legs. "I don't deny I'm lonely. But this was nothing more than a mockery designed to humiliate me. You know it's as much for your honour as mine that I cannot wed some common drab. Why subject me to this?" "As you two are so cosy," Constantine smoothed down his beard and gave a wintry smile, "I will make trial of how matters stand with the girls." Again he headed for the door, and his grandson held him back. "No. I will have an explanation from both of you." The old gentleman stilled so thoroughly it was almost uncanny to watch. His garments, away from the light of the fire, were all white and silver like his hair, and to Frank he looked like a picture cut from a black and white storybook, pasted into an illustration from a coloured volume. Vacarescu's hand tightened on his father's arm until the fingertips were equally white. But the old man showed no sign of discomfort at all. "What do you expect?" Constantine said at last. "Do you desire us to summon an heiress by arcane magic? Or do you expect to discover a hidden princess among the goose girls? If we may not journey to the capital to seek out our peers, this is the best you can hope for." "It's not just for our amusement that we want to go to Bucharest," Elia smiled. "It's for your sake too. Where else do you think the Boyarishnas are?" "This again." Vacarescu's mouth primmed, as though he had tasted something bitter. "This again." Constantine pulled his arm from the younger man's grip. They were of a similar height, but the elder still managed to give the impression that he was looking down on a child. "It does you no good to be stubborn. We will go to the capital, where we may live as those of our status were meant to live. Or I will escort the girls home personally, and let their parents know what you have done to them." The bitterness seemed to explode in Vacarescu's mouth. He flinched as if at a blow, turned his face away. "You will do what you must," he said heavily. "And so will I. We will not be going to Bucharest." A silence fell, as solid as iron, and then Constantine made a third attempt to leave the room, striding out unencumbered this time, with the flared skirts of his long coat flickering like moonlight behind him. A little later Elia too rose, patting Vacarescu's bent head as she went, and glided out. The brushing sound of her skirts lingered a while and then faded. The lines of Vacarescu's slumped form hardened slowly from misery back into anger. Frank, who had at first been seized by a strange compulsion to go in there and ask him honestly, man to man, what was going on, tiptoed away, padding back to his room to think. He made the mistake of sitting on his bed to do it. There, a week of disturbed nights and injury overcame him, and he slept. Thanks for listening. That was Sons of Devils, Chapter 3, read by Galadir. The music was Gifts of Stars by Lloyd Rogers, used with thanks from Pixabay. Next week, can Mirella get away? And can Frank ever get a clue?